The set was supposed to feel controlled, precise, a choreography of speed and danger that Hollywood had perfected over decades. But that morning carried an odd heaviness, a kind of quiet tension that clung to the asphalt like mist refusing to lift. Paul Walker arrived before the sun had fully risen, stepping out of his car with a casual calm that masked the weight he'd been carrying for months. His schedule had grown relentless, the demands of the studio stacking on him like invisible bricks, and this new sequence, rushed, underprepped, and strangely urgent, felt different. Crew members moved around him with strained smiles and sleepless eyes, their steps faster than usual, their voices clipped. Paul sensed it immediately. Something was off. He had been on more sets than he could count, had seen anxiety bloom and fade, but the undercurrent today felt sharper, almost frantic, as though everyone were pretending not to hear a ticking sound no one could locate. He found himself walking toward the small cluster of stunt coordinators gathered near the modified vehicle that would carry part of the high-speed rig. They were whispering, pointing at printouts, shaking their heads subtly. When they noticed him approaching, their posture straightened, their expressions rearranged into masks of professionalism. But Paul wasn't fooled. He had that intuition, an almost painful sensitivity to the emotional temperature of a room, that made it impossible for him to ignore the silent warnings pulsing beneath the surface. He asked them how the setup was going, whether everything had been signed off, whether the rig had passed safety checks. They nodded too quickly, talked too fast. One of them avoided eye contact entirely. Another kept glancing at the road where the stunt would take place, as if hoping the ground itself would answer for him. Paul felt a knot tighten at the base of his throat. This shoot was being rushed. He knew it. They knew it. But the studio wanted the sequence done. The schedule was already behind. And in Hollywood, pressure had a way of making people pretend they were fearless, even when fear was all they could feel. As the minutes crawled on, the hum of generators blended with the growing roar of engines warming up. The morning light sharpened, revealing every detail of the set, every shadow stretching across the ground like reminders of things better left unspoken. Paul walked among the crew, greeting them with genuine warmth, trying to steady the atmosphere with his presence. But their smiles were brittle today, weighted with unspoken concerns. One young crew member, someone Paul had seen on several sets but barely knew, looked particularly nervous. His hands trembled as he adjusted cables, and every few seconds he wiped his palms on his dusty jeans. Paul stopped for a moment, placing a light hand on the guy's shoulder, asking if he was all right. The man nodded, forcing a smile that cracked almost immediately, but he insisted everything was fine. Paul wanted to press further, but another assistant called him away toward wardrobe. He walked off with a growing sense of unease, feeling as though he had just stepped away from someone who desperately wanted to speak, but didn't know how. The stunt briefing came next, and though everyone gathered, the energy remained fractured. The coordinator speaking seemed distracted, stumbling slightly over his words, checking notes that appeared hastily prepared. Paul listened intently, his brow narrowing. The maneuvers described required precision, the kind of timing that demanded days of preparation. Yet they were attempting it after barely one night's setup. He raised his hand, asked about the emergency stops, about backup personnel, about risk assessment. The answers came, but they were thin, lacking the depth he needed to feel grounded. People were cutting corners. Paul could feel it in his bones. And the worst part was the realization that everyone felt it too, but had been swallowed by the inertia of production. A machine that never stopped, no matter who trembled beneath it. As he stepped away and moved toward the quieter edge of the set, the world around him dimmed slightly, as though his senses narrowed in on every flicker of doubt drifting through the air. He thought about the way Hollywood rewarded speed more often than safety, how schedules became commandments and budgets became gods. He thought about all the times he had trusted that others would speak up, and how often he had regretted staying silent. He wondered how many people watching this story might have been in similar situations, trapped in jobs that pushed them past the point of comfort, where fear became a secret companion. And in that moment, almost as a whisper meant for anyone who might later hear this story. His thoughts echoed into a question that now extends to you, watching from wherever you are. Where are you joining this story from? And have you ever felt that same quiet pressure that tells you something is wrong, long before anyone admits it? That tension tightened further when Paul reached his mark for the first run-through. The vehicle chosen for the rig sat too low, its frame shimmering with modifications done in a hurry. The stunt driver, a man with decades of experience, approached with a look Paul had never seen on him before, a mix of frustration and resignation. He confided in a low voice that some of the components weren't what he had requested. He didn't like the angle of the turn. He didn't like the lack of extra rehearsal time. He didn't like that production was pushing so hard. Paul felt a chill crawl across his skin. They both stood there for a long moment, neither speaking, because the truth between them was too loud to ignore. Someone needed to stop this, but they both knew how these decisions were made. Safety was always promised, but not always protected. Hours passed in a blur, the pace accelerating with every order barked through radios. The air grew hotter, the tension thicker, and somewhere in the midst of that rising pressure, the young crew member from earlier was assigned to monitor equipment at the far end of the run. Paul watched him walk across the lot, shoulders tight, steps unsteady. He wanted to call out to him, to ask again if he was sure he was all right, but the assistant director was already instructing Paul to get into position for another take. Cameras were rolling, engines were screaming, and Paul, heart pounding, slid into his mark with a sense of dread that pressed hard against his ribs. When the sequence began, everything moved fast, too fast. Dust exploded behind tires, engines wailed, metal vibrated from speed. For a moment, it felt almost controlled. Almost. And then came the sound. A snap, sharp and sickening, like something heavy giving way. Paul twisted instinctively, eyes widening as he saw equipment fracture at the far end, right where the young crew member had been standing. People shouted. The vehicle jerked. A plume of debris rose like smoke from a collapsing building. Paul didn't remember unbuckling or sprinting, but suddenly he was running, pushing past stunned crew, heart hammering with a terror he had never felt on any set before. He didn't make it in time. By the moment he reached the wreckage, the set had fallen into a horrific hush, broken only by panicked breaths and choked cries. Crew members gathered around a motionless shape lying against the fractured equipment. The young man's body was still. Too still. And in that terrible silence, something inside Paul fractured. His chest tightened as he knelt beside the aftermath, the metallic smell of dust and fuel clouding the air, a soundless scream echoing behind his ribs. He didn't know the man's name well, didn't know his story, but he knew this. The fear he'd seen in his eyes that morning had been real, and no one had listened, including him. People scrambled around them shouting for medics, but the truth hovered in the air like a dark veil descending over the entire production. The accident hadn't just happened. It had been coming long before the crash, built by pressure and silence, by rushing and ignoring, by pushing past limits that had been clearly felt but never acknowledged. Paul felt the sting of tears gathering, but refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not here. Not when the weight of responsibility pressed itself against every person present. He stood slowly, looking across the devastated set, his pulse uneven, his breath sharp. He could already see the fear spreading among the crew, the shame, the dawning realization that this catastrophe could have been prevented. And as Paul stepped back, one thought rose like a dark tide inside him, cold and unstoppable. Someone would try to spin this. Someone would try to protect the production before the truth. Someone would reduce this man's life to a footnote in a rushed schedule. And in that moment, he knew he would not let that happen. Not this time. Even before the studio spoke, even before the first apology was issued, Paul felt something burning quietly behind his ribs, a fury waiting to awaken. If you're still here inside this moment, breathing the same tense air that Paul felt tightening around him, take a second to let this story settle. This is where it begins to darken even further. And before we move deeper into the shadows of what came after, let me remind you, gently yet urgently, to join us, to remain part of these untold stories. Subscribing keeps this narrative alive, keeps these voices from fading, and allows you to walk with us into the truths hidden beneath the surface. The hours after the accident felt unreal, like a film caught between frames, the reel burning and flickering, but never stopping. The lot that once pulsed with noise now sat swallowed in silence, except for the low murmur of voices and the mechanical hum of emergency vehicles that came too late. Paul watched as paramedics moved with careful, futile precision. There was no saving him. The crew stood frozen, their eyes hollow, hands stained with dust and disbelief. And then the official voices arrived, the producers, the executives, the quiet men in dark suits who never belonged on a set, but always appeared when the unspeakable happened. They moved like shadows among the wreckage, whispering words that didn't fit the air around them. Phrases like protocol, liability, containment, words that made Paul's stomach twist. He stood there, still covered in the residue of the crash, staring at them as they spoke among themselves, barely acknowledging the loss that had just unfolded. It wasn't a man lying there anymore to them. It was a problem, a headline waiting to erupt. Paul could hear snippets of their conversation through the haze. Something about delaying the statement, coordinating with the studio's legal team, ensuring production wouldn't halt indefinitely. He wanted to scream, wanted to grab them and demand that they look at what had just happened. But the weight pressing on his chest kept him still, trembling with restrained rage. The night fell, the set lights dimmed, and still no one said the words that needed to be said. When he finally drove home, the silence in his car was unbearable. The sound of tires against asphalt felt like echoes of the chaos that had swallowed his morning. His mind kept replaying the young man's eyes, the trembling hands, the look of quiet fear he had ignored. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, the memory of that sharp metallic crack playing again and again like a broken reel in his head. By the time he reached his driveway, his heartbeat had settled into something darker, a kind of determination that came not from calm, but from a decision buried deep in anger. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room with the TV off, the faint light from the street painting long shadows across the walls. Messages flooded his phone, condolences, shock, confusion, but none from the studio. They were silent, and that silence spoke louder than any apology could have. It was a silence of strategy, of waiting for the right moment to reshape the narrative. And Paul knew how this industry worked. He had seen how it erased responsibility, how it polished every crack until the reflection looked clean again. But this wasn't going to be one of those times, not if he had a say in it. The following morning, a studio representative called him. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. She thanked him for his professionalism during the chaos, told him the company was devastated, and informed him that they were drafting a statement to the press. The word statement made his jaw tighten. He asked her if the family had been contacted yet. She hesitated, said she wasn't sure, said it was being handled. Paul hung up without another word, the quiet fury inside him beginning to form shape. He wasn't angry just because of the loss. He was angry because he knew they were already trying to turn it into damage control. By noon, headlines began appearing. Accident on fast shoot leaves crew, member dead. But the articles were vague, the details blurred, softened. The official statement from the studio arrived hours later, polished and hollow, dripping with carefully chosen words that meant nothing. It spoke of an unforeseen tragedy, of deep condolences, of commitment to safety. It read like every other corporate apology, the kind designed to sound human without feeling human. Paul read it once, then again, each line carving deeper into his chest until he slammed his phone down on the table. The fury that had been quietly burning now erupted. He called the production office, demanded to speak to someone in charge. They put him on hold for 12 minutes. When someone finally answered, their tone was the same, calm, placating. distant. Paul asked who approved the apology. They told him it came from the communications team. He asked if the studio planned to take responsibility for the rushed schedule, for the ignored warnings, for the silence that led to that man's death. They told him it was too early to make those determinations. Too early. Paul's voice shook when he spoke again, his restraint breaking into something raw and trembling. He told them the only thing that was too late was the life that had been lost. He left the call shaking, pacing his living room as memories of the morning played behind his eyes in slow motion. He thought of the man's family, who might now be reading the same sterile words online, learning of their loss through a press release crafted to protect profit margins. He thought of the crew, still traumatized, still cleaning the dust off their clothes while the studio drafted statements from air-conditioned offices. And he thought of himself, standing there, silent, while he knew something was wrong. Guilt and rage twisted together until he could barely breathe. That's when he decided he wouldn't stay quiet anymore. The next day, he called a friend, a journalist he trusted. He didn't want attention, didn't want scandal, but he wanted the truth spoken somewhere that the studio couldn't edit. They talked for hours. He described what he'd seen, what he'd felt, the warnings that had been ignored. The journalist listened, silent for most of it, her voice trembling only when she promised she'd make sure people knew what really happened. Paul didn't ask her to protect his name. He didn't care anymore about headlines. The story wasn't about him. It was about the system that had turned a man's death into an inconvenience. But the studio reacted quickly. Within hours of the first leaks, executives began calling. Some were angry. Some pretended to be concerned. They told him he was making things worse, that he was tarnishing the memory of the deceased by making it public, that he was risking his career, his relationships, his future. Paul listened, cold and quiet. And when they finished, he told them the only thing that mattered. You already tarnished his memory the moment you tried to hide it. They fell silent. Then came the veiled threats, contracts, clauses, non-disclosure agreements. But Paul didn't care. Something in him had shifted beyond the reach of fear. The image of that lifeless body wouldn't leave him, and neither would the sound of corporate apologies echoing through sterile boardrooms. He knew now what his purpose was: to make sure that name, that young man's name, didn't disappear into the endless noise of Hollywood accidents. He would speak until someone listened. Days turned into weeks, and still the studio refused to admit fault. They funded memorials, staged tributes, made donations, all beautiful on the surface, but hollow underneath. Paul attended the funeral quietly, standing at the back while others whispered, unsure whether to approach him. When the mother of the deceased approached and took his hand, he felt the last of his composure slip. She didn't ask for justice, she just asked for truth. That single word broke him open completely. Truth, something the industry had traded long ago for control. When the ceremony ended, Paul stood under the weight of the California sun, the world bright and unbearable, and promised himself that he would not let the story die. The studio's apology might have been crafted to end the conversation, but for Paul, it was only the beginning. He could feel the storm gathering within him, the defiance that would soon make him an enemy of the system that had once built him. And for the first time in years, he didn't care about the consequences. The world would hear what really happened, one way or another. The world outside didn't stop for grief. The headlines shifted quickly, devouring the tragedy before most people even had time to understand it. New stories replaced the old ones. The algorithms turned away. The public forgot. But Paul couldn't. Every morning when he opened his eyes, the first image that surfaced wasn't the movie he was supposed to finish, or the lines he was supposed to memorize. It was the face of that young crew member, frozen in memory, as if still asking him the question he couldn't answer. Hollywood had a cruel way of swallowing pain, polishing it, selling it back as spectacle. Paul had spent years inside that machine, smiling for cameras, repeating words about family and loyalty, all while knowing the truth beneath the surface was built on silence and fear. But this time, the silence was too heavy to carry. Weeks after the funeral, the studio called again. This time it was a meeting, not a phone call. They wanted to align perspectives, to restore trust. And Paul knew what those words meant. Control. Containment. The meeting took place in one of those glass-walled conference rooms high above the city, the kind that made everything below look small and distant. Executives lined the table like chess pieces, composed, polished, untouchable. A few nodded when he entered, their smiles thin as paper. The air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and something colder. Strategy. Paul sat opposite them, his hands clasped, his expression calm but unyielding. They spoke first. About moving forward, about ensuring the public maintained confidence in the project, about protecting the image of everyone involved. They said the word image as if it meant something sacred, and it made Paul's jaw tighten. He listened for a while, watching their mouths move, watching them twist a tragedy into a talking point. When they finally asked him to sign the revised statement, a new version, softer, more flattering to the studio, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the paper for a long, silent moment. The room seemed to slow around him. The words blurred. The apology read like a confession written by someone who'd never felt guilt. It wasn't meant to heal anyone. It was meant to erase. He placed the paper down, pushed it slightly away, and told them he wouldn't sign. The room went quiet. The faint hum of the air conditioner became the only sound. One of the executives cleared his throat, smiled that empty corporate smile, and asked him to reconsider. Paul didn't. He looked each of them in the eyes, one by one, and said what no one else dared to. "You're not sorry. You're scared." The words hit like a crack across glass. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another tapped a pen nervously. Paul stood slowly, feeling the weight of his choice settling on his shoulders. He knew what came next. Blacklisting, quiet phone calls, reputations rewritten. But the fear that once kept him compliant had burned away with that crash. He didn't need their approval anymore. He told them the truth, voice steady but heavy with grief. "You can't fix this with words. You can't buy forgiveness. You can only face it." Then he left, leaving the paper unsigned, the executives frozen in their chairs, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass behind them. That night, Paul sat alone in his garage, the place he always went when he needed to think. The smell of oil and metal felt grounding, real, something the industry could never manipulate. He ran his fingers over the hood of one of his cars, tracing the cool curve of the paint, remembering the early days, when driving meant freedom, when speed meant escape. But now, even that felt tainted. The road had taken someone who didn't deserve it. The set that was supposed to celebrate motion had become a place of stillness. He thought about walking away from it all, from the cameras, from the scripts, from the illusion. For the first time, the idea of disappearing didn't feel like fear. It felt like peace. But peace wasn't ready to find him yet. When the journalist published her piece, quietly, carefully, without sensationalism, it sparked something unexpected. Not outrage, not lawsuits, but whispers. Other crew members from other productions reached out anonymously, sharing their own stories of rushed schedules, ignored warnings, accidents buried under paperwork. One by one, their voices began to gather like embers catching wind. The studio tried to suppress it, but the silence had already cracked. Paul read every message that came through, some written in trembling words of fear, others filled with relief that someone had finally spoken. And though he didn't respond to all of them, he carried each story with him, like a scar. Still, the weight grew heavier. The industry began to turn its back quietly. Invitations faded. Projects stalled. Calls went unanswered. Friends avoided him at events, unsure how to navigate his defiance. They whispered words like liability and controversy. He became, in the studio's eyes, unpredictable, a danger to the illusion. But Paul didn't care anymore about belonging. What mattered now was memory. What mattered was that no one forgot what had happened. The more they tried to silence him, the more determined he became to keep the story alive. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply refused to move on. His calm, his refusal to perform forgiveness, became louder than any speech could have been. Late one evening, he returned to the set, now abandoned, production long since halted. The place was empty, but the ghosts of that day still lingered in the air. The broken equipment had been replaced, the ground cleaned, but he could still feel the echo of the impact. Standing there under the dim light, he realized the studio had already started preparing to use this same location for another shoot. They hadn't even given it time to breathe, to heal. The thought made his chest ache. He crouched down, pressed his palm against the cold concrete, and whispered a promise to the silence, that he would not let the world forget this spot, this story, this loss. He knew the camera might never capture that vow, but maybe it wasn't meant to. Maybe some truths only exist in the quiet, between the noise. He stayed there until dawn, watching the sky shift from black to bruised blue, the light spreading across the horizon like something trying to forgive the darkness. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to cry, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion, of love, of mourning for everything the industry had stolen. When the sun finally rose, he felt different. Lighter, somehow, yet still carrying a fire that wouldn't go out. He knew what he had to do next. If the studio could use cameras to tell lies, he would use them to tell the truth. Not about fame, not about glory, but about the people behind the lenses. The ones no one saw, whose names rolled by at the end of films while the audience left the theatre. The ones who built the dreams and sometimes paid for them with their lives. And maybe, if he could tell that story right, the silence would break for good. So if you're still watching this, still walking through this shadowed part of the story with him, remember that these moments aren't just about one man. They're about every voice that was never heard. Subscribe, stay with us, because the deeper we go, the more truth there is to uncover. Every story told keeps another from being buried, and you might be the reason someone finally listens. The storm didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as whispers in corridors, rumors on set, subtle edits in headlines. At first, the industry pretended not to notice Paul's defiance. They brushed it off as grief, as an emotional reaction that would fade with time. But it didn't fade. It grew. Every interview he gave, every brief appearance, carried the weight of his refusal to forget. His words weren't loud. They were calm, deliberate, sharpened by conviction. And that calm terrified them more than anger ever could. Because anger was easy to dismiss. But conviction, that was contagious. The months turned into a long, strange season of exile. Roles were offered, then quietly withdrawn. Contracts suddenly expired. Meetings ended in polite apologies. Paul knew the pattern. He'd seen it happen to others who had tried to pull truth into the light. But even as doors closed, something else began to open. Independent filmmakers, young crews, people who had worked in the shadows their whole careers, began reaching out. They wanted him involved, not as a star, but as a partner, as someone who could help them create safely, honestly, without the weight of the system pressing down on every decision. It wasn't fame anymore. It was purpose. He poured himself into these small projects not for recognition, but for redemption. On those new sets, there were no gilded trailers, no hovering executives, no marketing teams shaping every gesture. There was only work, real, grounded, human. He made sure every set followed safety protocols, made sure every crew member's name mattered, made sure no one felt replaceable. It became his quiet crusade, a way of rewriting the rules through action instead of argument. And yet, even in this new beginning, he couldn't escape the echo of what had happened. The studio's apology still lingered like a stain across every headline that bore his name. It wasn't just the falseness of the words that haunted him. It was the way people had accepted them so easily. Then came the anniversary. 1 year since the crash. The studio planned a public tribute, a ceremony filled with light and sound and the same carefully packaged emotions that made audiences feel safe. They invited him, of course. They even sent a formal letter embossed with the company's logo, describing how they wanted to honor the legacy of those we've lost. Paul read it in silence, the words swimming on the page like ghosts. There was something unbearable in the idea of them owning even the memory of the man they'd failed. He didn't attend. Instead, he drove. Far from the city, past the noise, to the edge of the desert where the world felt wide and honest again. The road stretched endlessly before him, shimmering under the heat, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. He stopped at a small gas station, bought a cup of coffee that tasted like dust, and sat outside watching the horizon. That's where he started writing, notes, thoughts, fragments of memory, all spilling out of him, as if the silence had finally cracked open. He wrote not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a witness. He wrote about the system that rewarded silence, about the people who paid the price, about how the truth had teeth but was still worth speaking. Those pages would never make headlines, but they became his way of keeping the story alive. When he returned to Los Angeles, something strange happened. A video began circulating online, an anonymous upload showing behind-the-scenes footage from that fateful shoot. It wasn't graphic, but it was raw. It showed the chaos before the accident, the warnings, the ignored hesitations. It showed the truth that the studio had buried. Within days, it spread everywhere. The public began asking questions. The same journalists who had ignored it a year ago were now chasing it. The studio released another statement, another apology, longer, more emotional, filled with the same orchestrated regret. But this time, no one believed them. The illusion cracked. And through that crack, light began to bleed. Paul never admitted whether he had released the footage. Some said it came from a whistleblower on the crew. Others whispered that he had kept it all along, waiting for the right moment. He never confirmed either way. What mattered to him wasn't credit. It was consequence. The studio faced investigations, halted productions, and for the first time, was forced to publicly acknowledge the human cost behind its mistakes. The apology that once enraged him now served as evidence of how deeply they had failed to care. But justice in Hollywood is never clean. It came slow, fragmented, twisted through layers of money and manipulation. Lawsuits were filed, settlements made, but the pain never left the ground where it began. Still, for Paul, something shifted. For the first time, he felt that silence no longer belonged to them. It belonged to those who had broken it. The truth, no matter how small, had survived. He started appearing less in front of cameras and more behind them, producing, mentoring, protecting. People said he seemed quieter, older, as if each sentence now carried the memory of a promise. On the rare occasions he spoke about that year, his voice would soften, eyes distant, and he'd say the same thing every time. No movie is worth a life. The words hung in the air like a verdict, impossible to argue with, impossible to forget. And yet, even as he rebuilt himself, even as he turned his pain into purpose, a part of him remained haunted. Some nights, when the city lights blurred outside his window, he'd imagine that young man still walking among the sets, smiling, working, alive in all the futures that never came. Those were the moments that broke him quietly, not with tears, but with the kind of ache that never fully leaves. But he accepted it, because grief, when faced honestly, becomes something sacred, proof that love and conscience can outlast the machinery of fame. So, if you've followed this story all the way here, through the silence, the fury, and the fire, take a moment before this fades into the next thing. Remember what this was truly about. Not the speed, not the stunts, not the spectacle, but the people behind it. The hands that hold the cameras, the voices that stay unseen, the lives that make the stories possible. Like this video if you felt the weight of it. Subscribe if you believe these stories deserve to be told. and leave a comment, not just for him, not just for Paul, but for every name that got lost behind the spotlight. Because remembering is how we keep them alive.